a make-believe land, on a make-believe shore, where the plans that you plan and the dreams that you dream all come true.
Sometimes, performers win an Oscar on their first try. They're a critical darling and knock it out of the park so thoroughly and impressively the Academy has no choice but to anoint them early, putting that heavy crown on their head as a symbol of greatness.
Very nervous about what to say.
For others, it takes a while, if it happens at all. Decades and decades of wading through B-movies and typecasting until they weaponize their persona and go-to genre at the exact right time to win the big prize. The latter is definitely the story in 1970, when John Wayne won Best Actor for the role of Rooster Cogburn in True Grit, in a category that boasted the likes of Dustin Hoffman, Jon Voight, Peter O'Toole, and Richard Burton. With such stiff competition, featuring actors who were quickly transforming the industry and other well-loved favorites, how did Wayne win? The answer lies in transformation, both physical and societal. The Western genre is one that could only really exist in the United States in its earliest iterations, and is, as a result, extremely American. One of the oldest films, The Great Train Robbery, was a Western, so the genre had been around as long as moving pictures had been fascinating audiences. Cosmetically, Westerns feature cowboys, Native Americans, Mexicans, damsels, dames, madams, dirt, dust, horses, and gunfights. Thematically, Westerns are stories about good and evil, foreign invasions, and conforming to, or bucking, gender dynamics. Good guys good, bad guys bad, evil never triumphs, and no one questions or faces repercussions for their relentless pursuits. It is part of these early Westerns that Wayne gets his start in the movies. Wayne's career began in 1926 and was as old as the Oscars themselves at the time. He putzed around in uncredited roles in silent movies for 4 years until he got his first starring role in 1930's The Big Trail.
Could you sight us to a second Missouri anywhere out yonder?
Sure, but it's a long, tough pull from here. 2,500 miles away you'd have to go. No, it's too far off.
No place is too far if it's what we want.
This is a land beyond Oregon.
His stardom wouldn't truly captivate American audiences until 1939's Stagecoach, and by then, his persona was distilled to one very important aspect. He's just playing himself. Anyone who knew Wayne well or worked with him for a number of years will say he was a reactor instead of an actor, which brought Wayne into a more naturalistic style of acting well before the Stanislavski method took over Hollywood. Longtime collaborator, director John Ford, said of his style, "He's not something out of a book, governed by acting rules. He portrays John Wayne, a rugged American guy. He's not one of those method actors like they send out here from drama schools in New York. He's real, perfectly natural." Fellow actor Raoul Walsh said, "Wayne underacts, and it's mighty effective not because he tries to underact, it's a hard thing to do if you try, but because he can't overact." And when you watch a John Wayne performance, at least ones where he is playing himself, this is very, very true. Wayne's film presence does not come from in-depth character work, but rather how well he embodies just a normal guy doing stuff. And that stuff just happens to be pretty epic. At the peak of his popularity, starring dominantly in Westerns, the roles Wayne tended to play could be considered wish fulfillment. The days of outlaws riding into unknown and undocumented Native American lands was over, and urban sprawl was just beginning. When you watch The Searchers, this persona makes sense, but when you watch The Conqueror, which requires the suspension of disbelief of Wayne playing Genghis Khan, one realizes maybe character work wasn't his strong suit.
You do well, Kumlik, for while I have fingers to grasp a sword and eyes to see, your treacherous head is not safe on your shoulders.
And because of his choice of roles, there was perhaps little to distinguish John Wayne the actor and John Wayne the capital C citizen. A staunch Republican, Wayne was quite outspoken in his beliefs. His characters were upstanding, masculine, gun-toting gentlemen who rigidly clung to gender roles and reject moral turpitude. There is high reverence for the military as well. Most importantly, however, was his support of HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, which, if you know your history, aggressively questioned and opposed anyone suspected of having ties to communist ideals. Those that were suspected were put on a blacklist and thus unable to work in their respective fields. This impacted his fellow actors, screenwriters, and composers across the industry, and this blacklist would stick for the next few decades. After World War II, Wayne's pursuits took on more than just acting. He began to produce and direct his own films with strong, patriotic tones, yet simplistic points of view. The most successful of these was his film The Alamo, which was nominated for 7 Oscars in 1961, including a Best Picture nomination for Wayne as producer.
Where's the basement?
Excuse me?
Aren't we going to see the basement?
There's no basement at the Alamo.
Critical reception was mixed, though, as many concluded Wayne was a more commanding presence in front of the camera than behind it. His next valiant effort would be 1968's The Green Berets, which made money but failed spectacularly with critics. The film, an anti-communist pro-South Vietnam epic, was panned for its take on a complex global conflict. Said critic Clifford Terry for the Chicago Tribune, "The most fatal mistake of it all, however, is presenting the United States' most complex war in the simplest of terms." Roger Ebert called it a movie depicting Vietnam in terms of cowboys and Indians. Because of this melding of his personal politics and film performances, it became hard for the public, particularly critics and fellow actors, to separate the two. According to Michael Munn, author of John Wayne, The Man Behind the Myth, perhaps because he made so many bad movies, perhaps because of his right-wing politics which made him unpopular in many quarters, the critics of the past refused to take him seriously because John Wayne usually only ever played John Wayne. Yet today, critics delight in dissecting his varied characterizations because now they have a complete body of work they can look back on and analyze, and they see that there are exceptions to the rule. That decline in popularity, at least from a personal standpoint, came mostly from the new wave of stars that were slowly taking over in the mid to late 1960s. I mean, can you blame them when Wayne said this to Kirk Douglas when he played Vincent van Gogh? "We should never play those kinds of weak, sniveling characters. I don't ever want to see you in a part like that again. They have no dignity." And, yeah, okay, sure.
We have never seen eye to eye on a lot of things. But professionally, I think he's one of the most professional actors I've ever worked with.
As attitudes towards masculinity changed in the 1960s, this was, as the kids say, a hot take.
Maybe we'll have dinner together one night during the whole picture. But we get along very well. We never discuss politics.
Stay off politics,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
However, he was far from disrespected by his peers, who generally had nice things to say about the man, how he was dedicated to his craft. In fact, he had been nominated for Best Actor in 1950 for his role in Sands of Iwo Jima, a war film depicting the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. This role was riding the zeitgeist of jingoistic conservatism that had the 1950s in a chokehold following the Second World War. He would lose the award to Broderick Crawford for All the King's Men in a role Wayne turned down due to the script being unpatriotic. Lol. But as the new voices in Hollywood carved their names into the pantheon, that's not to say Wayne's stardom waned in any real capacity throughout his career. Far from it. In 1973, he ranked a healthy 9th in Motion Picture Herald's annual poll of box office draws after appearing on it for 15 consecutive years. However, nervousness set in with Wayne regarding his career around this time. A young blood named Clint Eastwood was making waves with his spaghetti westerns, causing Wayne to panic. Wayne was quoted with saying, "I was getting anxious because there was this young guy named Clint Eastwood making westerns in Italy and having tremendous success with them. All of a sudden, the studios all wanted Eastwood to come and make westerns for them, but they were not the kind of westerns I'd been making. They were tough and bleak," in clear opposition to Wayne's own films.
Oh, Blackburn, what's party? No whiskey. We go home.
What had come about since Wayne made The Searchers and other projects in the 1950s was that of the revisionist western, a subgenre characterized by blurring traditional lines of good and evil, gender, and survival. Wayne was still a box office draw, but the tastes of the American public were changing along with the political and social landscape of the time. Highly respected both personally and professionally, he knew a shift was needed to stay relevant. And to him, that would come in the form of a morally ambiguous, overweight sheriff who had an eye patch and a bushy mustache.
And how big is John Wayne? I'm interested in dimensions.
I'd say John's about 6'4".
He is that tall?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
No wonder you don't see eye to eye.
Rooster Cogburn is not a hero. He's not even the protagonist of Charles Portis's novel True Grit. That role belongs to the headstrong Maddie Ross, the 14-year-old narrator whose quest to avenge her father's needless death results in her losing something of her own. In the story, Maddie hires washed-up and callously violent U.S. Marshal Rooster Cogburn to bring her father's killer to justice. He is described pathetically and with wariness from certain characters, but Maddie believes he's the man for the job because he possesses grit, something she admires and has a great deal of herself. In the company of haughty and air-headed Texas Ranger Levy, the trio learn about one another and eventually bring the killer to justice. Rooster's first mention is after Maddie witnesses the hanging of 3 criminals, our first indication that this world is a violent and cold place.
No, I'm here. I'll see it all. My goodness.
Who is the best marshal they have? The sheriff thought on it for a minute. The meanest one is Rooster Cogburn. He is a pitiless man, double tough, and fear don't enter into his thinking. He loves to pull a cork. From the jump, Rooster is not a typical John Wayne character. He is not considered upstanding or level-headed. He is the meanest marshal. Maddie chooses him because of his description, because she wants the coward who killed her father, Tom Chaney, to face justice regardless of who captures him. When Maddie first sees Rooster, she's underwhelmed. She describes him, "I was surprised when an old, one-eyed Jasper that was built along the lines of Grover Cleveland went up and was sworn. I say old. He was about 40 years of age. The floorboards squeaked under his weight. He had a mustache like Cleveland, too." This is not the typical description for a John Wayne character, who are usually virile, muscular, trim men who wear crisp, pristine costumes and have 2 functioning eyes. Maddie decides to offer Rooster $50 to hunt Chaney after watching him give a wry and comical testimony, but she is given the runaround.
We leave for the territory this afternoon to get Tom Chaney.
Well, you're not going.
You've misjudged me.
I can't go up against Ned Pepper's gang and try and take care of a baby all at the same time.
I'm not a baby.
You'll slow me down. There's no hot grub or warm beds out there.
I've slept out at night before.
They eventually settle on a $100 fee and are joined by LaBeef, a Texas Ranger who has, beef with Chaney for similar reasons. The two set off without her, however. Despite his obvious misreading of Chaney as a mastermind, Rooster prefers LaBeef's company to Maddie's by the simple matter of his gender. She fords a river on her horse in order to join them, and her determination demonstrates a genuine thirst for justice. And while Rooster is usually able to bully his clients, he meets his match with Maddie and sticks up for her when Levy starts beating her for supposed talkback. Rooster raised his voice and said, "Put that switch down, Levy. Do you hear me talking to you?" Levy stopped and looked at him. Then he said, "I'm going ahead with what I started." Rooster pulled his cedar-handled revolver and cocked it with his thumb and threw down on Levy. He said, "It will be the biggest mistake you ever made, you Texas brush hopper." Rooster's defense of the girl, in part due to her own grit and his observations of her willingness to see the bounty through, is a pivotal moment because from then on, he treats her almost as an equal. In one of the parallels to Wayne, not only is Rooster a drunkard, a gunslinger, and has razor-sharp wit, but there's also a softer side to his character that comes out a bit further into their adventure. He tells Maddie of his early life before becoming a marshal, where he had a wife and child, bought and worked at a restaurant in Illinois, and admits to taking money from a high-interest bank, which Maddie considers stealing, regardless of the institution. Rooster replies like this.
That's the position them New Mexicans took. I had to flee for my life. Bo was a young colt then. No horse could run him into the ground. When that posse thinned out, I turned old Bo around and, taking them reins in my teeth, I charged them boys firing 2 Navy 6s. They must have all been married men that loved their families, 'cause they scattered and run for home.
Which is a beautifully tall tale Maddie does not believe in the slightest. She insists Rooster is telling stories because, after all, the only person who was there between them is the one telling it. He can embellish all he wants. He does have his heroic moment later, though, when, after shooting at Cheney's gang in the very manner described earlier, he pulls Maddie out of a rattlesnake pit and rides his horse to death to get her to a doctor. Rooster dies many years later, and Maddie purchases him a larger gravestone than the state-issued one he would have received. So, True Grit, the novel, is one I would consider a revisionist Western. It fits a lot of the criteria. A female protagonist, morally ambiguous take on who would normally be considered the hero, the characters learning about one another, and changing their stances to the escapades. It's great work all around by Portis, so it's no wonder Wayne would want to sink his teeth into the role. He tried to buy the rights himself at first, but found producer Hal Wallace had already snapped them up.
And he took a terrible, painful long pause and said, "Hal, it's about
grit."
And we never discussed it again.
Thankfully, Wallace wanted Wayne as Rooster. The only hesitations were, surprisingly, the eye patch. Wayne said, "Hal Wallace told me Rooster not only wore an eye patch, but also had a big mustache. I didn't mind the mustache too much, but I said, Hal, my fans don't expect to come and see me and find I look like an old pirate. So Hal said, tell you what, forget the mustache, but the eye patch stays. I thought he'd made a bad mistake." Later, though, like Nicole Kidman's nose, Wayne would go on to thank the eye patch for helping him win.
If I'd known that, I'd have put that patch on 35 years earlier.
The 1969 film version of True Grit maintains a lot of the spirit of the novel, but shies away from a lot of what makes it, for lack of a better word, grittier. It takes place in the summer and fall as opposed to winter, makes Rooster less pathetic when Maddie first meets him, allows Maddie to keep her arm instead of seeing it amputated, and lets us watch Rooster ride off on his horse with a wave of his hat, instead of hearing of his untimely and unceremonious end. The latter, especially, would be expected of a John Wayne picture, and the downer ending of the novel would not have been included given this preconceived notion. And it would open up the world for the eponymous sequel in 1975 called Rooster Cogburn, starring Wayne again, alongside Katharine Hepburn, of all people, but that's another story. Early on, producer Hal Willis and director Henry Hathaway predicted Wayne would score an Oscar nomination for his work. The script was too good, and the layers of Rooster maintained through screenwriter Marguerite Roberts, who had been blacklisted, by the way, was too numerous and too juicy to ignore.
I mean to kill you in 1 minute, Ned, or see you hanged in Fort Smith at Judge Parker's convenience. Which'll it be?
I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man.
Fill your hand, you son of a bitch!
And Wayne got to play all of it to a fare thee well, and in return, the Duke received glowing reviews for his performance, though most seemed either impressed or baffled by his transformation. Roger Ebert said, "Can that fat old man be John Wayne?" Yes, it can. Variety wrote, "Wayne towers over everything in the film. Actors, script, even the magnificent Colorado mountains. He rides tall in the saddle as the fat old man." Consensus was that he had never been in finer form, even if some of his performance was a bit over the top.
Oh.
I'll give you another $25 when we leave, and $50 when the job is done.
Well, I guess we can get started at first light.
Said director Hathaway, "I knew Duke was going over the top, but I let him do it because it was a whole different color to any other part he'd played. I thought that he was a pure caricature and not even one of himself, even though some critics said he was a caricature of himself. I thought, critics are so goddamn arrogant and think they know it all. They're gonna say, 'Good God, Wayne can act.'" While usually understated, Wayne is the show in True Grit. Their performance is very showy and brash, swinging for the fences. He tells stories with great aplomb and is broad where it needs to be broad, funny where it needs to be funny, and heroic when called for.
Well, General, look what we got.
He's loud, he's quiet, he's drunk, he's less drunk. It's a roller coaster of a performance, which everyone knew was not typical Wayne fare. About the role, Wayne said, "That was me letting myself have fun. For the first time, I felt like an actor." And as many actors who are later in life and well-respected will tell you, a hammy performance in a well-worn genre is sometimes enough to cross the finish line.
It's like that thing when you're both driving down a road and you see a car coming. Oh, no, I messed that up. I screwed up the line.
Okay, if we're sharing our favorite Jenna Maroney lines. No, how does it start?
Barbra Streisand, the previous year's Best Actress co-winner, announced the nominees for Best Actor at the 42nd Academy Awards. The slate consisted of Richard Burton for Anne of the Thousand Days, Peter O'Toole in Goodbye Mr. Chips, and Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, both for Midnight Cowboy. I'd like to give Midnight Cowboy some space here because, by many metrics, either Hoffman or Voight should have claimed this Oscar quite easily, or at the very least, were in second or third place. Midnight Cowboy is a kaleidoscopic queer odyssey about Joe Buck, played by Voight, a down-on-his-luck guy who quits his small-town dishwashing job to move to New York and becomes a male prostitute. Along the way, he meets a drifter named Rico Razzo, who Joe Buck takes to calling Ratso, played by Hoffman. It is a sexually charged and sexually ambiguous romp through New York City's seedier dwellings, and was the first X-rated film to be nominated for, and win, Best Picture. The film was praised by critics for its tone and bleak nature, but the dual performances of Hoffman and Voight were singled out as some of the best acting of the year. For the film's 25th anniversary, critic Owen Gleiberman wrote for Entertainment Weekly, "What is shocking is to see a major studio film linger this lovingly on characters who have nothing to offer the audience but their own lost souls." Wow. What high praise. Much more substantial than, "He's fat now, I guess." Hoffman had burst onto the scene in his Oscar-nominated performance in The Graduate 2 years prior, so he was definitely on the Academy's radar. The range on display between Benjamin Braddock and Ratso Rizzo showed an actor at the very pinnacle of talent and prestige.
I'm walking here! I'm walking here! Don't worry about
about that. Actually, that ain't a bad way to pick up insurance, you know.
Hoffman was, however, quite against award shows as a concept. After his win for Kramer vs. Kramer, Frank Sinatra would chastise him, saying, "Contrary to what Dustin Hoffman says, it's not an obscene evening. It's not garish. It's not embarrassing." This would not diminish his awards viability, though, because he would go on to win 2 Oscars for Best Actor within 10 years. However, his criticism of the institution may have held him back this time. Voight was also brand new to Hollywood, with Midnight Cowboy only being his 3rd film credit. Robert J. Landry, writing for Variety, wrote of his performance, "He ought to make it big with this one release." Coming from stage and television roles, Voight demonstrates an idealized naivete early in the film when he gazes upon a man lying in the street. Whether dead or unconscious, he doesn't know. Ominous foreshadowing for the film's downer ending for sure, but Voight was deemed new and shiny enough to award later on in his career, which would be carried out when he won Best Actor for Coming Home. The late 60s were an odd time for the Academy, as the films that received critical, financial, and awards attention were a truly eclectic mix. Then President Gregory Peck made a huge effort to include younger voices in the voting body in an attempt to reflect the seismic societal shifts occurring that decade, but plenty of the old guard continued to exercise their voting rights. While Academy demographics are not published, one can assume, based on the nominees throughout this period, there was a fight for dominance of taste. Points against either of the Midnight Cowboy boys winning is that classic mantra: they split votes. However, I can also understand how the film would be jarring and off-putting to the Academy, despite its win for Best Picture. This strange, queer, technicolor, nihilistic portrayal of 2 men roughing it was just daring enough to cause the younger members of the Academy to pick it over the stodgy Anne of the Thousand Days and Hello, Dolly. The previous Best Picture winner, Oliver, was the first and only winner to be rated G, so what better than to flip 180 degrees and award the first and only X-rated winner? A succinct way to personify the Academy literally dragging away the schmaltzy studio-driven output, kicking and screaming. The final 2 nominees are Richard Burton in Anne of the Thousand Days and Peter O'Toole for Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Of Burton's performance of Henry VIII, Vincent Canby wrote for the New York Times, "Burton, whose film career has included a series of almost great performances, is in excellent form and voice. Funny, loutish, and sometimes wise." Anne of the Thousand Days follows the tempestuous relationship of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and is an adaptation of a 1948 play, and is, in my opinion, a rather plodding costume drama that is technically dazzling, but narratively and dramatically dire. And the film would, by sheer mathematics, be the film to beat if we go by 2024's award standards. With 10 nominations, it topped the night. This might have been in part due to the aggressive awards campaign conducted by the studio, who allegedly held screenings for voting members that included pricey champagne and filet mignon. Reviews were mixed, but the performances of Burton and newcomer Genevieve Bujold were enough to buoy the project into prestige territory. Wayne himself praised Burton and would often remark that if anyone were to have won here, it should be him. Burton would ultimately be nominated for 7 Oscars throughout his career without winning once, and for anyone who asks, by 1969, he should have been a winner by then, probably for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but more compelling narratives and trends occurring each year he was nominated kept him in his seat. More notorious for his win-loss tally is Peter O'Toole, record-holding 8-time Oscar loser. Loser is kind of harsh because O'Toole is rightfully a legend, but he does suffer a bit from Glen Close syndrome. The Academy likes you, but there's always someone else to push you out of the way, even though you really deserve it by now.
Out of the way, you!
O'Toole stars in a musical adaptation of Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which had already been an Oscar darling back in the 1930s. This version, with songs stapled onto the narrative, was praised for its production values and performances, with only the songs getting kicked around. At best, toe-tapping for the evening, at worst, bland and forgettable. Roger Ebert wrote, "Ross has concentrated on telling his story and hasn't let the songs intrude. That's particularly lucky since Leslie Percusi's music and lyrics are sublimely forgettable. There's not a really first-rate song in the show." Of O'Toole, he said, "O'Toole succeeds in creating a character that is aloof, chillingly correct, terribly reserved, and charming all the same. And for a musical film in the late 1960s, that's about where you want to be." To many critics, it was, "O'Toole's done it again," but neither O'Toole nor Burton, as well established as Wayne was, would win the award. Burton was 44 in 1969, O'Toole was 37. Wayne was 62, one bottle of whiskey from the grave, and a member of the bedrock of Hollywood A-listers that still dominated the awards body. The former two would have plenty of time to make up for their losses. In theory. However, this analysis discounts what Wayne had done to earn the award. Not only did Wayne have the box office appeal and goodwill built in for his chances, but he did have the edge over the others due to that eye patch.
Wow! If I'd have known that, I'd have put that patch on 35 years earlier.
This is crucial, as it shows us Wayne was willing to do the classic Oscar Beatty trope, a transformative performance. Remember the reviews mentioning his weight and his own hesitancy at wearing the eye patch. These very aspects, at least to me, were tantamount in awarding Wayne the top prize. I would also argue this scene with Maddie, where he finally speaks to the young character like she's a person, is also responsible, as it showed the 20-somethings voting that Wayne wasn't all bark and bite.
Did you have any children?
There was a boy. Nola taking him with her. He never liked me anyway. A clumsier child you'll never see than Horace. I bet he broke 40 cups.
Never did get you for stealing that money.
Well, I didn't consider it stealing.
Didn't belong to you.
I needed a road stake. It was like that little high-interest bank in New Mexico. Needed a road stake, and there it was. I never robbed no citizen taking a man's watch.
It's all stealing.
The fidelity to his persona, yet departure and examination of it through the screenplay, and yes, the irony of Wayne loving the screenplay penned by a formerly blacklisted screenwriter is not lost on me, is also a factor here. With the extremely forward-thinking win for Midnight Cowboy, with its revisionist view of what male-male relationships would look like on screen, to the holding up of the old guard through Hello Dolly, Wayne stands on a precipice, straddling these two ideas. Enough edginess is maintained that, when the Wayne-isms do poke through, they are just a shade of Rooster's character instead of an inconsistency. The lack of restraint from Hathaway allowing Wayne to play and act made him the show. Despite the adaptation bending itself to fit more into the style of Wayne's other roles, despite his politics, despite him playing himself over and over and over again, this transformation around and on display for Rooster Cogburn was enough to get that gold statue in his hand. And can you blame the old fat guy just for having fun?